fear, self-centeredness, and exclusivity of our predominantly narcissistic culture, and through our craft to cultivate a more empathetic.
Everyone thought they were Hollywood's perfect couple. Winona Ryder and Johnny Depp, the indie queen and the rising rebel, looked like a match made in cinematic heaven. But behind the magazine covers, red carpet kisses, and matching tattoos, something far darker was happening. For decades, Winona kept her silence. She defended him. She avoided interviews. She refused to speak about what happened when the cameras stopped rolling, until now. In a private, off-the-record moment, she finally broke down, and what she whispered left the room in complete silence. Because Johnny Depp didn't just break her heart, he shattered something far deeper, something that haunted her for years, and changed the way she saw herself forever. Behind closed doors, there were moments no one saw: the volatile arguments, the fear, the confusion of loving someone who made her feel both safe and unsafe. The emotional swings that left her crying in bathrooms before movie scenes. Hollywood painted Depp as the tortured genius, but no one asked what it meant for the woman who lived with that torment. And when Winona tried to walk away, it wasn't just heartbreak that followed, it was a breakdown so intense, she disappeared from the spotlight for nearly a decade. For the first time, she's finally saying what happened, not out of revenge, but because before the fame, before the heartbreak, before Johnny Depp, there was simply Winona. She was born Winona Laura Horowitz in a quiet farmhouse in Olmsted County, Minnesota, on the 29th of October, 1971, but her childhood was anything but quiet. Her parents were free-spirited intellectuals, part of the counterculture movement, who named her after the nearby town and surrounded her with books, poetry, and radical politics. At age 7, her family moved to a commune in Northern California. No electricity, no television, just wilderness and words. For most kids, that would have been an adventure. For Winona, it was isolation. She spent hours alone, reading Salinger and Sylvia Plath by candlelight, escaping into imaginary worlds because the real one didn't feel safe. When she finally entered public school, everything shattered. On her first day, dressed like a character out of a 1942nd novel, her classmates mistook her for a boy and beat her up in the hallway. Bloodied and bruised, she ran home and asked, "Why don't they see me?" That question would follow her for the rest of her life. She wasn't popular, she wasn't bubbly, she wasn't what the world expected a teenage girl to be, but she had something else: depth, a heavy emotional presence that casting directors noticed immediately. At just 13, she auditioned for her first role, reading a passage where she had to speak about loving someone who didn't love her back. When asked to say something about herself at the end of the audition, she simply looked into the camera and said, "I know I'm weird, but I think weird people change things." She got the part. Her parents supported her acting, but not in a Hollywood dream way. They warned her about fame, about people who would try to use her, about losing herself. But at that point, Winona already knew what it felt like to be misunderstood. At 15, she landed a breakout role in Lucas. At 17, she lit up the screen in Beetlejuice. But the world didn't see the shy, fragile girl underneath. They saw attitude, style, rebellion. She became an icon without asking for it. And then came Heathers, the dark cult classic that turned her into every misfit's fantasy: cool, wounded, and untouchable. But Winona wasn't untouchable. She was still that girl from the hallway, still aching to be seen for who she really was. That was when Johnny Depp entered her life. He saw through the surface. He read her poetry. He listened to her fears. He called her "my girl" in interviews and tattooed "Winona Forever" on his arm. To the world, they were magic. To Winona, he felt like home. But she had no idea that loving him would eventually tear apart everything she had built, including herself. By the late 1982nd, Winona Ryder was no longer just a promising actress. She was becoming a symbol. After Beetlejuice, casting directors began chasing her, hungry for that rare mix of vulnerability and defiance she projected with just a glance. She didn't smile to please. She didn't flirt to charm. She felt deeply, and the camera couldn't look away. Her choices were bold. She rejected teen rom-coms and instead chose Heathers, a pitch-black satire about murder, suicide, and the toxic underbelly of high school life. It nearly didn't get made. Studio executives called it too dark, too weird, but Winona fought for it. She didn't just want to be famous, she wanted to be real. And then Hollywood began to bend around her. With Edward Scissorhands, she entered a new realm, a dreamlike film where her fragility met Johnny Depp's tortured intensity. Directed by Tim Burton, the film became a gothic fairy tale that blurred the line between fiction and reality. Off-screen, she and Johnny had already fallen in love. On-screen, they became immortal. By 1991, Winona Ryder was the most sought-after young actress in Hollywood. She starred in Mermaids, Bram Stoker's Dracula, The Age of Innocence, and Reality Bites. The industry saw her as the new face of intelligent cinema, the rare actress who could carry both box office and emotional weight. She worked with legends, Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and Tim Burton. She received Golden Globe nominations, critical praise, and a fan base that saw her as the voice of a generation. But behind the carefully lit movie sets and photo shoots, something quieter was happening. Winona was overworked, exhausted, and emotionally drained. She flew from set to set, interview to interview, rarely sleeping, always performing, even off-camera. The pressure to remain relevant, edgy, authentic, was crushing. And then there was Johnny. At first, their love gave her fuel. They were inseparable. She once said, "When I met Johnny, I thought my life had just begun." But the deeper she fell, the more she began to lose herself in his world, a world of intensity, unpredictability, and secrets. While she was busy building an empire, Johnny was wrestling with his own demons, anger, jealousy, and a growing dependence on substances that Winona couldn't control. And still she stayed. She believed in him, defended him, loved him harder. But the signs were there. During the Dracula press tour, she broke down in tears off stage. During The Age of Innocence, she was constantly fatigued. Rumors swirled of arguments behind closed doors, of Johnny disappearing for days, of broken furniture and unspoken fears. Yet to the world, they were still the golden couple. On red carpets, they held hands. In interviews, they praised each other. She called him her soulmate. He called her my everything. But behind the flashbulbs, the cracks were getting deeper. Hollywood didn't notice, or maybe it didn't care. Because Winona was still delivering masterpiece after masterpiece, and Johnny Depp, he was rising too. The darker he got, the more they loved him. And no one asked how that. The headlines never captured what really broke Winona Ryder. To the outside world, her split with Johnny Depp in 1993 was just another Hollywood breakup, but to her, it felt like dying. No cameras caught what happened in those final months, the shouting matches behind locked hotel doors, the bruises that weren't physical, the silence that grew between two people once obsessed with each other. Johnny had changed. Fame wasn't just feeding his career, it was feeding his rage. Winona, still soft-spoken and emotionally raw, couldn't keep up with his mood swings, his disappearances, the unpredictability that crept into their nights. He would vanish for days, come back smelling like whiskey and regret, and collapse beside her as if nothing had happened. She didn't know which version of him would show up next, the tender lover who wrote her poems, or the distant man who couldn't even look her in the eye. At first, she thought she could fix it. She stayed silent. She lied to friends. She told herself it was just the pressure, the fame, the media. But inside, she was unraveling. Her mental health began to deteriorate, insomnia plagued her, panic attacks struck during interviews, she couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep. And Johnny wasn't there anymore. The man who had once said he'd die for her was now cold, angry, and accusing. Rumors of infidelity swirled, fueled by paparazzi shots and whispered gossip in studio lots. Still, Winona said nothing. Even after they officially ended the relationship, she refused to speak badly of him. When asked about the breakup, she simply said, "It was my first real heartbreak. It was more than love, it was like a soul fracture." But her silence cost her. In the years that followed, Winona slipped into something darker. She withdrew from the spotlight, turning down roles, disappearing from industry events. Friends noticed her growing paranoia. She began seeing a therapist daily. On some nights, she wouldn't leave her house for days, staring out the window with dark circles under her eyes, lost in memories she couldn't escape. Then came the collapse. In 2001, she was arrested for shoplifting nearly $5,000 worth of designer goods from Saks Fifth Avenue. The footage of her in handcuffs, disoriented and dazed, was splashed across every tabloid in the country. The world mocked her. Late-night hosts turned her downfall into punchlines. Commentators called her washed up, crazy, over. But no one asked what led her there. No one saw the years of emotional neglect. The spiral that began the day Johnny Depp slammed the door. There was a moment when even Winona Ryder thought she wouldn't survive. It came not on a red carpet or in front of flashing lights, but in a sterile hospital room, the walls humming with fluorescent silence. After her arrest, her world collapsed in slow motion. Not only was she stripped of roles and recognition, but of her identity. For a woman who had spent her life slipping into other characters, she no longer knew who she was without the camera. "I didn't want to die," she would later admit, "but I didn't know how to live anymore." At her lowest point, she isolated herself in her Los Angeles home, barely speaking to anyone. For weeks, she stayed in bed. Books that once brought her solace now stared blankly from shelves. She couldn't read, couldn't feel, couldn't act. And worst of all, she couldn't forget. She couldn't forget the way Johnny once held her like she was fragile glass. She couldn't forget the way he stopped looking at her. She couldn't forget how Hollywood turned her pain into punchlines. The girl who had once stood beside Tim Burton, Coppola, and Scorsese now sat alone with nothing but prescription bottles and memories. Friends tried to reach out. Her family begged her to come home, but trauma doesn't respond to logic. It buries itself deep behind smiles and scripted lines. For years, Winona remained in that limbo, not dead, but certainly not living. And then, something shifted. In 2005, during a quiet interview, a journalist asked her what she missed most about acting. She paused for a long moment, then whispered, "I miss being seen." That sentence echoed long after the interview ended. It was more than a statement about fame. It was a truth about being invisible, not just to Hollywood, but to the person who once promised to love her forever. That year, she quietly checked herself into a treatment facility. Winona Ryder didn't vanish. She evolved. In a world quick to cancel, quick to forget, she did something far more powerful than a comeback she endured. Not through revenge, not through press tours, but by living quietly, on her own terms, and speaking only when she was ready. When Stranger Things premiered in 2016, a new generation saw her not as a fallen star, but as a force. A woman whose eyes still held the weight of everything she'd lived through, and yet, she stood. Stronger, clearer, unapologetically human. Her co-stars call her a mentor. Her directors say she brings something untouchable to every scene. But what resonates most with audiences today isn't just her talent, it's her truth. She taught the world that vulnerability is not weakness, that pain doesn't need to be shouted to be real, and that sometimes the most courageous thing a woman can do is survive. When asked recently what she'd say to her younger self, the one who fell for Johnny Depp, who disappeared under the weight of silence, she smiled and said, "You made it. Not perfectly, not without scars, but you made it." Maybe we never really knew Winona Ryder in her prime. Maybe we were too busy watching the story Hollywood wrote for her. But now, in her own voice, on her own terms, she's telling it back not as a victim, but as the woman who outlived the storm. And maybe that's the most powerful role she's ever played.